Have you ever wondered what it truly felt like to travel across medieval Europe, not as a king, not as a knight, but as an ordinary traveler on horseback? No drama, no battles, just the slow, steady rhythm of the road. Tonight, you will ride through forests, cross cold rivers, sleep in shared lofts, and wake with the dawn bell. This is a slow, immersive journey into the medieval world, so settle in and let the road unfold. Chapter 1. The Last Morning in Auxerre. The familiar scent of damp stone and old straw pulled you from sleep. The rough linen of the inn's sheet was cool against your skin. From the courtyard below came the day's first sounds, the clatter of a bucket, the murmur of voices, the slow, heavy tread of a draft horse shifting in its stall. The light filtering through the room's single-shuttered window was the pale gray of a morning in early autumn, in the year of our Lord 1020. You rose, the packed earth floor cold underfoot. The routine was methodical, worn smooth by repetition. The saddlebags, heavy leather darkened with use, lay open on the stool. You checked the provisions, a wedge of hard, pale cheese wrapped in cloth, a bundle of dried, salted meat, a clay-stoppered bottle of small beer, and a larger, sloshing wineskin of cheaper red. A linen pouch held a few handfuls of oats, not for you, but for the mare. Your spare hose and tunic were rolled tight. Lastly, you secured the small, sharp dagger in its sheath to your belt. Its weight, a practical fact, a tool for cutting rope or meat, not for display. Down in the courtyard, the stable boy was already at work. You found him brushing the bay mare, Elara, in her stall. Her coat, the color of old pennies, shone where the straw dust had been swept away. You took the brush from the boy and worked it over her flanks and shoulders, feeling the powerful muscle beneath the winter-thickening coat. You ran your hands down each leg, lifting each hoof to check for stones or cracks in the horn. The boy fetched the saddle, a high-pommeled affair well stuffed with wool, and the thick felt pad that went beneath. You settled it gently, watching Elara's ears for any twitch of discomfort, then bent to tighten the girth strap, one notch, then two, firm but not biting. You shrugged on your own wool cloak, its weight a welcome barrier against the mist that clung to the morning. With a final check of the bag's buckles, you took Elara's bridle and led her out of the stable into the inn yard. The mist softened the edges of the timbered buildings and curled around the legs of a carter already hitching his oxen. You nodded to him, a silent fellowship of the early road, and led Elara into the narrow street. Auxerre was waking, shutters were opening overhead. The smell of baking bread drifted from a side alley. You walked, the mare's hooves clopping softly on the wet cobbles towards the eastern gate. Ahead, the squat, solid towers of the cathedral rose against the lightening sky. It was not the soaring, lace-like spire it would one day become, but a fortress of faith, its Romanesque bulk anchored firmly to the earth. Your glance at it was not wistful, but orienting a last marker of a known place. At the city gate, the guard, huddled in his own cloak, gave you a bored look and waved you through. Beyond the walls, the world opened into a tapestry of muted greens and browns. The road, little more than a wide track of churned earth and stone, pointed east. A slow flow of carts, wagons, and other travelers on foot was already upon it, a sluggish artery of commerce and pilgrimage. You swung up into the saddle, the leather creaking a familiar complaint. Elara shifted, eager for the track's beginning. You touched your heels to her sides, and she stepped forward, merging without ceremony into the slow, steady current heading into the dawn mist. Chapter 2. The Road Through the Forest. Part 1. The last cobbled street of Auxerre's outskirts ended as abruptly as a dropped rope. One moment, the ground was firm gray stone. The next, it was a dark, sucking mud, churned by a century of wheels and hooves, leading into a wall of trees. The forest took you in without ceremony. The air changed instantly. The open chill of the morning fields condensed into a deeper, damp coolness that settled on your skin and beaded on the wool of your cloak. The vast, misty sky was gone, replaced by a ceiling of interlocking branches, still heavy with the russet and gold of autumn leaves not yet ready to fall. Sound changed too. The distant rumble of carts, the calls of drovers, the general hum of the roads gathering, all were swallowed by the trees, replaced by a closer, more intimate orchestra. Foremost was the steady, rhythmic times thud-squelch times of Alara's hooves in the soft earth. It was a sound you felt through the saddle as much as heard, a deep percussive heartbeat for the journey. Against it played the creak of leather, the saddle with each of her strides, the bags as they shifted, the reins as you adjusted them in your gloved hands. From high in the canopy came the distant, mechanical tapping of a woodpecker, a sharp staccato counterpoint. Somewhere to the left, a jay scolded, its harsh cry cutting through the damp air before silence flowed back in. Light became a fragmented thing. The sun, climbing higher, could only penetrate the canopy in scattered beams. It fell in shifting, dappled pools on the track, illuminating the deep ruts filled with leaf-stained water, catching the glossy back of a beetle struggling through the mire. It painted the trunks of the great oaks on one side in bars of pale gold, leaving the other side in velvety shadow, etched with deep grooves of bark like weathered parchment. You rode through alternating bands of cool shadow and sudden, surprising warmth, the temperature shifting on your face with each pace. The track narrowed, the forest pressing in. Brambles and dogwood formed a tangled wall on either side, their leaves tipped with the first frostburn of the season. The smell was rich and complex. The sweet rot of fallen leaves, the sharp, clean scent of damp moss, the faint, earthy perfume of unseen fungi. It was the smell of things returning to the soil, a process as old as the hills. After perhaps an hour, a shape emerged from the green gloom beside the track, a moss-covered milestone, its carved Latin numerals nearly swallowed by lichen. You drew Elara to a halt. The silence, now that the hoof falls had ceased, felt profound. Only the drip of moisture from a branch and the soft sigh of her breathing. You dismounted, boots sinking into the soft loam, and brushed the moss from the stone's face with your sleeve. The carving was faint but legible. AVG Vesta times one way, AVSIODVVRVM times the other. You were on course. It was a small, practical satisfaction. From your bag, you broke a piece of the journey bread, hard and dark. You offered half to Elara on your flat palm. Her lips, soft and whiskered, took it delicately, and she crunched it with slow, thoughtful chews, her warm breath clouding in the cool air. You ate your own portion, the taste simple and grainy, washing it down with a mouthful of small beer from the clay bottle. It was not a meal of leisure, but a necessary refueling, done standing beside the ancient stone. Remounting, you settled back into the rhythm. Your world narrowed to the feel of the worn leather reins, the steady rise and fall of the saddle, the play of light and shadow. The town-bound thoughts, the innkeeper's final accounting, the face of the stable boy began to loosen their grip, untethered by the endless, gentle motion. They were replaced by nothing grand, only an awareness of the immediate, the pressure of the saddle against your thighs, the way Elara's ears twitched forward at a rustle in the undergrowth, the gradual deepening of the quiet as you journeyed further from the world of men and deeper into the green, breathing heart of the wood. The road was no longer something you joined, it was all there was. Chapter 2. The Road Through the Forest. Part 2. The forest thickened, the oaks growing broader and closer together, their branches weaving a tighter lattice overhead. The light dimmed to a perpetual, green-tinged twilight, and the air grew still and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. The track, less traveled here, was a darker ribbon of mud between walls of fern and holly. A new smell pierced the organic richness, a sharp, acrid tang of smoke. Around a gentle bend, a clearing opened to the left. In its center stood a low, domed hut, built of woven sticks and turf, from which a thin, gray plume seeped into the sky. A charcoal burner's mound, a large, earth-covered pile of smoldering wood, sat beside it like a sleeping beast. A man emerged from the hut's low doorway, his face and hands blackened with soot, his clothes patched and stained the same indefinite gray. He carried an iron-tipped pole. He saw you, and his eyes, white in his darkened face, met yours. No words were exchanged. You raised a hand in brief acknowledgement. He gave a slow, single nod before turning back to prod at his mound, tending the slow fire that would turn oak into valuable carbon. The encounter lasted 3 heartbeats. You passed, the sharp smoke clinging to your clothes for a dozen paces before the forest's damp breath reclaimed you. Not long after, another sign of human passage appeared. Set back from the track in a small niche formed by the roots of a vast beech tree was a roadside shrine. It was a simple box of weathered, moss-flecked wood, its pitched roof shingled with pieces of bark. Inside, a crudely carved wooden figure of a bearded man with a child on his shoulder stood against the back wall. The paint that had once defined St. Christopher's features had long since flaked away, leaving the wood silvery and smooth from weather and touch. At the base of the shrine, a small pyramid of stones had been piled by passing travelers. You drew Ilara to a halt. Dismounting, you looped her reins over a low branch. The silence here was different from the deep wood. It felt attentive, expectant. You approached the shrine. The air was cool and carried a faint, old scent of damp wood and stone. You stood for a moment, not in prayer as a priest would understand it, but in a moment of focused respect for the saint of wayfarers, a recognition of the peril all journeys held. Then, bending, you selected a smooth, palm-sized stone from the edge of the track. Its surface was cool and slightly damp. You added it carefully to the pile, the soft times, clack times of stone on stone, sounding loud in the quiet. It was a traveler's custom, a small, physical plea for safe passage, a token left to join the hopes of hundreds who had passed this way before you. The act was practical, superstitious, and rooted in the old ways, all at once. Back in the saddle, the journey's meditative pace settled deeper into your bones. Your observations turned to textures. The bark of an ancient ash tree near the path was a rugged landscape of deep fissures and hard ridges, like frozen lava. You passed a birch, its papery skin peeling away in translucent curls, pale as a ghost against the gloom. The air tasted of damp leaves, a sweet, tannic taste at the back of the throat. The town-bound thoughts that had lingered in the first league were now fully dissolved, washed away by the rhythm of travel. There was no room for reflection on the past or anxiety for the future. Your mind was occupied by the immediate, the need to guide Ilara around a particularly deep rut, the observation of a flock of tits flitting through the understory like animated leaves, the calculation of the sun's position through the canopy, marking the passage of the afternoon. The journey itself became the only thought, a slow, steady unwinding of league after league, each much like the last. The forest was not a place to be traversed with urgency, but a space to be moved through, a vast, breathing entity that demanded a patient pace. Your world was the track ahead, the feel of the reins, the sound of breath and hoof fall, and the gradual, undeniable sense of distance accumulating beneath you, a quiet testament to the day's labor. Chapter 4. The First Ford. The forest's embrace loosened gradually. The dense canopy of oak and beech gave way to stands of thinner alder and willow, and the air lost its still, fungal weight, carrying instead a fresher dampness and a new sound, a low, steady murmur of moving water. The track, descending a gentle slope of exposed tree roots and slick clay, ended abruptly at a wide, shallow river. It was not a dramatic torrent, but a broad, patient flow perhaps 30 paces across. The water, the color of polished slate under the overcast sky, slid over a bed of rounded stones, visible just beneath its surface. On the far bank, the track resumed, climbing into more open woodland. This was no bridge crossing, no moment of engineered convenience. It was a ford, a simple break in the land's logic that required a pause, a calculation, and a physical negotiation. You dismounted, your boots sinking into the soft black mud of the bank. Elara shifted beside you, her ears pricked forward at the water. "Easy," you murmured, running a hand down her damp neck. Leaving her ground-tied, you walked a few paces upstream and then down, scouting the crossing. The riverbed here was a mosaic of stones, smooth, water-worn cobbles of granite and limestone, and the water looked no deeper than your knee at its most generous channel. A line of slightly darker, smoother stones formed a natural causeway, a submerged path worn by countless previous crossings. It was the obvious route. Returning to Elara, you unbuckled the saddlebags and lifted them down, setting them on a relatively dry hummock of grass. It was a precaution. A slip, a sudden plunge, and soaked provisions were worse than wet legs. You tightened the girth a notch, ensuring the saddle would not shift. Then, taking the bridle in your left hand, you led her to the water's edge. "Now, steady," you said, your voice low and even. You stepped into the river. The cold was instant and shocking, a sharp ache that pierced the worn leather of your boots and seized your calves. The water, faster moving than it appeared from the bank, pressed insistently against your legs, tugging at your balance. You felt the stony bottom through your soles, slippery with algae, uneven but firm. You took a slow, deliberate step forward, testing your footing before shifting your weight. Elara hesitated, her hooves planted in the mud. You clicked your tongue gently, applying soft pressure to the bridle. With a soft snort, she stepped in after you. The crossing became a careful, shared dance. You moved first, planting each foot with care, feeling for stable purchase on the rounded stones. Elara followed, her iron-shod hooves clacking and scraping as she picked her way. The water rose to just above your knees, soaking your wool hose completely. The cold was a dull, penetrating throb now, the heavy, wet wool clinging to your skin like a second chilly hide. You spoke to her constantly, a stream of quiet nonsense, times easy now, good girl, just there times more for the tone than the meaning, a thread of calm connecting you in the midst of the river's pull. Midstream, the current was strongest, pushing at your thigh. Elara's head came up, her muscles tense. You stopped, letting her find her balance on the stones, your own feet braced wide. For a moment, there was only the rush of water, the cold, and the solid, living presence of the horse. Then she blew out a breath, lowered her head, and stepped forward again. The far bank approached, a tangle of roots and pale clay. You scrambled up first, your wet boots slipping on the mud, then turned to help guide her the last few steps. With a final heave, she was up, water streaming from her belly and legs, her hooves planting firmly on solid ground. You stood for a moment, breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the focused tension of the crossing. The discomfort was immediate and mundane. Your hose were soaked, leaden with water, and already the chill was settling into your bones. Your boots squelched with each shift of your weight. Leading Elara a few paces from the bank, you unpacked your simple lunch. You chose a broad, flat rock that had captured a few hours of weak autumn sun. Its surface was dry and held a residual warmth. You spread your wool cloak over it to dry, the dark green fabric steaming faintly. Sitting, you wrestled with the laces of your boots, peeling off the sodden hose. The air was cool on your bare, pale skin, raising gooseflesh. You laid the hose beside the cloak, their weight evident in the way they slumped, lifeless. From the saddlebag, you retrieved the wedge of hard cheese, the bundle of dried meat, and the clay bottle of small beer. The cheese was crumbly and sharp on your tongue. The meat was tough, requiring slow, methodical chewing. The beer was flat and slightly sour, but it washed the dust of the road from your throat. You ate without haste, your gaze resting on the river you had just crossed. It flowed on, indifferent, a constant, undramatic obstacle that would be here tomorrow and for 1,000 years after, waiting for the next traveler to make their own careful negotiation. Downstream, a movement caught your eye. A gray heron stood statue still in the shallows, its long, sharp beak poised above the water. Then, with a strike faster than thought, it plunged its head beneath the surface, emerging a moment later with a small, silver fish wriggling in its jaws. It tipped its head back, swallowed, and resumed its watch. The entire event was silent, efficient, and part of the river's own ancient rhythm. You watched until the bird, perhaps sensing your attention, unfolded its great wings with a slow, powerful beat and flew downstream, its long legs trailing behind. You finished your meal, the simple fare sitting heavily and comfortably in your stomach. The sun, breaking briefly through the cloud, warmed your face and began to take the deep chill from your discarded hose. This was the reality of travel. The fords, the cold wetness, the pause for sustenance, they were not adventures. They were the granular, physical increments of distance, the small, repeated trials that separated one place from another. You pulled on the still damp hose, the chill of fresh shock, then your boots. You folded your cloak, now merely damp, and repacked the bags. Checking Elara's hooves for any stones lodged from the riverbed and finding none, you swung back into the saddle. The wet wool of your hose chafed against the leather. You turned her head, and without a backward glance at the ford, you moved on, the water's murmur fading behind you, replaced once more by the steady, rhythmic sound of hooves on an earthen track. Chapter 5. The Village of Thatch and Smoke. The forest's edge frayed into scattered hawthorns and pasture. The track, drier now and rutted by the local traffic of a smaller world, curved around a low hill crowned with a stand of wind-bent pines. As you rounded the bend, the village appeared, not as a sudden sight, but as a gradual accumulation of human signs against the fading afternoon light. First came the smell, not the clean, damp scent of the woods, but a complex, layered aroma of life lived closely with earth and animal. The sharp, mineral tang of wood smoke. The rich, fungal odor of manure piled beside a sty. The dry, sweet smell of harvested grain stored in ricks. And beneath it all, the unmistakable, comforting scent of baking bread, warm and yeasty, carried on the breeze. Then the sounds reached you, not the single vast quiet of the forest, but a tapestry of small, specific noises. The rhythmic, metallic times, clang, clang, clang times of a blacksmith's hammer striking iron from somewhere ahead. The indignant bleat of a goat tethered by a wattle fence. The high, unrestrained laughter of children, which ceased abruptly as you came into view. A cluster of perhaps 20 dwellings lined the track, which now served as the village's single street. They were humble structures, their walls a lattice of woven hazel sticks, wattle daubed over with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw that had dried to a lumpy ochre gray. The roofs were thick, sloping mats of rye thatch, mossy and uneven, like the fur of some great sleeping beast. In the small yards, scrawny chickens scratched at the bare earth. The children, 3 of them, barefoot and clad in rough, undyed tunics, had been chasing a wooden hoop. They stopped their game and stood frozen, their eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on you and the horse. A stranger, even one on a simple mare, was an event. You met their gaze and gave a slow, neutral nod, the kind offered to ward dogs. They did not respond, only watched until you had passed. Then you heard the whisper of their resumed play behind you. You followed the smell of bread. It led you to the village's heart, a wider area of trodden earth. Here stood the communal oven, the times for banal. It was a domed structure of clay and stone, larger than any of the houses, with a soot-blackened mouth. A low fire glowed within its depths, and the heat radiating from its sides was palpable even from several paces away. This was not a convenience, but a feudal right. The lord of the manor owned the oven, and the villagers paid in kind or in small coin to bake their dough here, a tangible piece of the manorial system in baked clay. An old woman emerged from a cottage adjacent to the oven. Her back was bent, her face a map of deep lines, and her hands, clasped before her, were knotted and strong. She wore a dark, homespun dress and a linen coif. She watched you approach, her expression not unfriendly but reserved, assessing. You drew Elara to a halt and dismounted. "Good day," you said, your voice sounding rough from disuse. She nodded once. "Day?" she replied, her voice thin but clear. "I smell your bread. Is any to be sold?" Her eyes flicked to your saddlebags, your boots, the mare, calculating your means. "Aye, for a coin, just out of the heat." She turned and shuffled back into the cottage's dark interior, emerging a moment later with a round loaf cradled in a fold of her apron. It was dark brown, crusted with flour and ash from the oven floor, and it steamed faintly in the cool air. She held it out. You fished in the leather purse at your belt, finding one of the smaller clipped silver pennies. You placed it in her palm. Her fingers closed over it, and she tested its weight with a subtle movement of her thumb before tucking it into a pouch at her waist. She transferred the loaf to your hands. The heat was immediate and profound, a solid, radiating warmth that seeped through your gloves. You thanked her with another nod, which she returned before turning back to her cottage, the transaction complete. There was no further conversation, no offer of ale or gossip. You were a passing source of a rare coin, nothing more. You stood for a moment, absorbing the village. The blacksmith's hammer fell in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. A woman emerged from a doorway with a bucket, heading towards a well. The wattle and daub walls of the cottages showed their construction plainly. The vertical stakes driven into the ground, the horizontal withes woven between them, all sealed with the daub that was already cracking in places, revealing the woven skeleton beneath. It was architecture of immediacy and local materials, designed for shelter, not posterity. Your own needs were immediate. You led Elara to a stone trough fed by a wooden pipe from a spring. The water was clear and cold. She drank deeply, her slurps loud in the interval between hammer strikes. You drank from your own hand beside her, the water tasting of stone and cold. The loaf's warmth was a palpable comfort against the growing chill of late afternoon. You did not eat it yet that would come at evening camp, but you placed it carefully in a saddlebag, not wanting to crush it. Its heat, pressed against the leather, felt like a small, contained piece of hearth. With Elara watered, you remounted. The children had gathered again at a distance, watching your departure as they had your arrival. You raised a hand in a brief, silent farewell. One of the smaller ones tentatively raised his own. Then you touched your heels to Elara's sides, and she moved on, leaving the sounds of the hammer and the bleeding goat behind. The track led out past the last cottage and its dung heap, back into the open fields that awaited the dusk. The village of thatch and smoke receded into the landscape, a brief, vivid pocket of concentrated life, already fading into memory as the steady rhythm of the road reclaimed you, the warmth of the fresh bread a small, enduring solace against your chest. Chapter 6. The Stone Inn. At dusk. The purple of twilight was not a single color, but a deepening gradient from the bruised, clear sky overhead to the indigo shadows pooling in the ruts of the road. The day's last light gilded the tops of the western hills, but in the valley where the crossroads lay, the world was cooling into monochrome. It was there you saw it, a solid, square-built structure of gray local stone, 2 stories high, with a steeply pitched roof of dark slate. A weathered pole, from which hung a crude carving of a tankard, creaked in the evening breeze. The Stone Inn. A low wall of the same gray stone enclosed a yard of churned mud and straw. You led Elara through the open gate. The air here smelled of damp earth, horse dung, and the sweet, greasy scent of a wood fire. A stable, little more than a lean-to with a thatched roof, stood against the far wall. A boy, perhaps 12, with a shock of straw-colored hair and a face smudged with dirt emerged from its shadows, eyeing Alara with a practiced look. "Stable her?" he asked, his voice cracking between youth and manhood. You nodded. "Full rubdown, good hay, and a measure of oats if you have them." "Oats extra," he said, already taking the reins from your hand. "Aye, see she's done proper." You handed him one of the small, worn copper coins from your purse, a times denier. He bit it briefly, a habit more than a test, and tucked it away, his manner becoming marginally more attentive. You unbuckled the saddlebags and your bedroll, slinging them over your shoulder. The weight was familiar, a comfortable burden. You gave Alara a final pat on the neck, feeling the day's sweat drying in her coat. "Rest well," you murmured. She nudged your arm with her nose, then allowed the boy to lead her into the gloom of the stable, where the sounds of other horses shifting and chewing filled the air. Turning, you shouldered your gear and approached the inn's main door. It was a heavy thing of oak planks, studded with iron nails, and set under a shallow stone arch. From within came a muffled roar of conversation, the clatter of pottery, and the crackle of a substantial fire. You pushed it open. The heat and noise struck you like a wall. The common room was long and low, its ceiling a forest of soot-blackened beams from which hung bunches of dried herbs, smoked hams, and strings of onions. The floor was packed earth, strewn with fresh rushes that gave off a faint, grassy scent, undercut by the older smells of spilled ale, sweat, and wood smoke. The heart of the room was a massive central hearth, a stone-lined pit where a fire of logs and peat blazed, its smoke rising to blacken the beams before finding its way out through a hole in the roof. The light it cast was restless and orange, painting the faces of the occupants in flickering relief. The room was perhaps 2/3 full. A group of carters in heavy leather aprons clustered around one table, their voices loud over dice. A pair of men who looked like petty traders argued quietly over a parchment. In a corner, a pilgrim with a scallop shell sewn to his hat sat silent, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. The air thrummed with a dozen fragmented conversations, none meant for your ears, all adding to the tapestry of the evening. You found space at the end of a long trestle table, sharing a bench with a man who had the weathered, patient look of a local cart driver. He gave you a brief, incurious glance and a grunt, shifting his wooden bowl an inch to make room. You nodded your thanks and set your bags on the floor between your feet. A serving girl, her face flushed from the fire, approached. She wore a stained linen dress and a tired expression. "Pottage and ale?" she asked, her tone making it the only obvious choice. "Aye," she returned shortly, thumping down a thick pottery bowl and a wooden tankard. The bowl was rough under your fingers, its glaze imperfect, warm from the contents. Inside was a thick, gray-brown stew pottage. It steamed, releasing an aroma of onions, turnips, and a vague meatiness, likely from a scrap of salted pork or a ham bone. Pieces of dark, coarse bread floated on the surface like rafts. The ale in the tankard was cloudy and lukewarm, smelling faintly of yeast and the wood of the barrel. You ate with a wooden spoon provided, its bowl worn thin from use. The pottage was hearty, salty, and filling, the vegetables soft to the point of disintegration. It was food for labor, not for pleasure. The ale washed it down, its bitterness cutting through the grease. As you ate, you listened, your gaze lowered to your bowl, but your ears open. The conversations were shards of local life. "Old Mark Sow farrowed 12, but 3 were runts," said the levy. "For the Lord's new mill is to be paid in barley, not rye. Mud on the north road past the mill stream is axle deep. Lost a wheel there Tuesday last. Heard from a tinker that the Count's men are looking for deserters near Toul. Price of salt is up again. No one spoke to you. No one asked your business. You were another anonymous shape in the firelight, your presence noted and filed away without comment." The cart driver beside you finished his meal, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and rose with a sigh. heading towards the stairs that led to the sleeping loft. His place was soon taken by a young man with the red, chapped hands of a dyer. When the bowl was empty, you drained the last of the ale. The fire's heat had soaked into your clothes and skin, driving out the autumn chill from the road. The innkeeper, a broad man with a vast apron and a bald head that gleamed in the firelight, moved through the room collecting coins. You paid him 2 more copper times denarius times for the food, drink, and a place to sleep. He jerked his thumb towards the stairs. Loft, blankets at the foot of the pallets. Douse your candle before sleep. You took your gear and climbed the narrow, twisting staircase. The loft was a single, long, low room under the eaves, lit by a single tallow candle in a sconce that filled the space with the smell of burning fat. Along the walls were simple wooden pallets, thin straw mattresses laid on rope webbing, each with a folded gray woolen blanket. Several were already occupied by snoring shapes. You chose an empty one near the far wall, away from the draft of the staircase. The blanket was scratchy and smelled faintly of lye and old sweat. You spread your own cloak over the pallet for an extra layer, then sat to pull off your boots. The simple acts unbuckling the bags, checking that the precious loaf of bread was still intact, laying out your spare hose for the morning, were rituals of road life. You blew out the candle, plunging the loft into a darkness broken only by the faint, flickering orange light from the common room hearth rising through the cracks in the floorboards. The sounds from below were muted now, a distant rumble of final drinks and settling. You lay back on the pallet. The straw rustled and poked through the cloak. The blanket's rough weave scratched your chin. From the other pallets came the symphony of the road-weary, snores, grunts, the rustle of turning bodies. The air was close and warm, thick with the smell of unwashed wool, straw, and humanity. It was not comfortable, but it was shelter. It was safety from the night and the road. The day's travel, the forest, the ford, the village, the long leagues settled into your muscles as a deep, satisfying ache. As the last murmurs from below faded, and the inn fell into the deep quiet of night, broken only by the occasional cough or the stamp of a horse in the stable below, you let the rhythm of the stranger's snores and the residual warmth of the fire in your bones lull you into a hard, dreamless sleep. Chapter 6. The Stone Inn at Dusk. The purple of twilight was not a single color, but a deepening gradient from the bruised, clear sky overhead to the indigo shadows pooling in the ruts of the road. The day's last light gilded the tops of the western hills, but in the valley where the crossroads lay, the world was cooling into monochrome. It was there, you saw it, a solid, square-built structure of gray, local stone, 2 stories high, with a steeply pitched roof of dark slate. A weathered pole, from which hung a crude carving of a tankard, creaked in the evening breeze. The Stone Inn, a low wall of the same gray stone, enclosed a yard of churned mud and straw. You led Elara through the open gate. The air here smelled of damp earth, horse dung, and the sweet, greasy scent of a wood fire. A stable, little more than a lean-to with a thatched roof, stood against the far wall. A boy, perhaps 12, with a shock of straw-colored hair and a face smudged with dirt, emerged from its shadows, eyeing Elara with a practiced look. "Stable her?" he asked, his voice cracking between youth and manhood. You nodded. "Full rub-down, good hay, and a measure of oats if you have them." "Oats extra," he said, already taking the reins from your hand. "Aye, see she's done proper." You handed him one of the small, worn copper times denarius times from your purse. He bit it briefly, a habit more than a test, and tucked it away, his manner becoming marginally more attentive. You unbuckled the saddlebags and your bedroll, slinging them over your shoulder. The weight was familiar, a comfortable burden. You gave Elara a final pat on the neck, feeling the day's sweat drying in her coat. "Rest well," you murmured. She nudged your arm with her nose, then allowed the boy to lead her into the gloom of the stable, where the sounds of other horses, shifting and chewing, filled the air. Turning, you shouldered your gear and approached the inn's main door. It was a heavy thing of oak planks, studded with iron nails, and set under a shallow stone arch. From within came a muffled roar of conversation, the clatter of pottery, and the crackle of a substantial fire. You pushed it open. The heat and noise struck you like a wall. The common room was long and low, its ceiling a forest of soot-blackened beams from which hung bunches of dried herbs, smoked hams, and strings of onions. The floor was packed earth, strewn with fresh rushes that gave off a faint, grassy scent, undercut by the older smells of spilled ale, sweat, and wood smoke. The heart of the room was a massive central hearth, a stone-lined pit where a fire of logs and peat blazed, its smoke rising to blacken the beams before finding its way out through a hole in the roof. The lighted cast was restless and orange, painting the faces of the occupants in flickering relief. The room was perhaps 2/3 full. A group of carters in heavy leather aprons clustered around one table, their voices loud over dice. A pair of men who looked like petty traders argued quietly over a parchment. In a corner, a pilgrim with a scallop shell sewn to his hat sat silent, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. The air thrummed with a dozen fragmented conversations, none meant for your ears, all adding to the tapestry of the evening. You found space at the end of a long trestle table, sharing a bench with a man who had the weathered, patient look of a local cart driver. He gave you a brief, incurious glance and a grunt, shifting his wooden bowl an inch to make room. You nodded your thanks and set your bags on the floor between your feet. A serving girl, her face flushed from the fire, approached. She wore a stained linen dress and a tired expression. "Pottage and ale?" she asked, her tone making it the only obvious choice. "Aye," she returned shortly, thumping down a thick pottery bowl and a wooden tankard. The bowl was rough under your fingers, its glaze imperfect, warm from the contents. Inside was a thick, gray-brown stew pottage. It steamed, releasing an aroma of onions, turnips, and a vague meatiness, likely from a scrap of salted pork or a ham bone. Pieces of dark, coarse bread floated on the surface like rafts. The ale in the tankard was cloudy and lukewarm, smelling faintly of yeast and the wood of the barrel. You ate with the wooden spoon provided, its bowl worn thin from use. The pottage was hearty, salty, and filling, the vegetables soft to the point of disintegration. It was food for labor, not for pleasure. The ale washed it down, its bitterness cutting through the grease. As you ate, you listened, your gaze lowered to your bowl, but your ears open. The conversations were shards of local life. Old Mark's sow farrowed 12, but 3 were runts, said the levy, for the Lord's new mill is to be paid in barley, not rye. Mud on the north road past the mill stream is axle deep. Lost a wheel there Tuesday last. Heard from a tinker that the Count's men are looking for deserters near Toul. Price of salt is up again. No one spoke to you. No one asked your business. You were another anonymous shape in the firelight, your presence noted and filed away without comment. The cart driver beside you finished his meal, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and rose with a sigh, heading towards the stairs that led to the sleeping loft. His place was soon taken by a young man with the red, chapped hands of a dyer. When the bowl was empty, you drained the last of the ale. The fire's heat had soaked into your clothes and skin, driving out the autumn chill from the road. The innkeeper, a broad man with a vast apron and a bald head that gleamed in the firelight, moved through the room, collecting coins. You paid him 2 more copper times denier's times for the food, drink, and a place to sleep. He jerked his thumb towards the stairs. "Loft, blankets at the foot of the pallets. Douse your candle before sleep. Hello." You took your gear and climbed a narrow, twisting staircase. The loft was a single long, low room under the eaves, lit by a single tallow candle in a sconce that filled the space with the smell of burning fat. Along the walls were simple wooden pallets, thin straw mattresses laid on rope webbing, each with a folded, gray woolen blanket. Several were already occupied by snoring shapes. You chose an empty one near the far wall, away from the draft of the staircase. The blanket was scratchy and smelled faintly of lye and old sweat. You spread your own cloak over the pallet for an extra layer, then sat to pull off your boots. The simple acts unbuckling the bags, checking that the precious loaf of bread was still intact, laying out your spare hose for the morning were rituals of road life. You blew out the candle, plunging the loft into a darkness broken only by the faint, flickering orange light from the common room hearth rising through the cracks in the floorboards. The sounds from below were muted now, a distant rumble of final drinks and settling. You lay back on the pallet. The straw rustled and poked through the cloak. The blanket's rough weave scratched your chin. From the other pallets came the symphony of the road-weary, snores, grunts, the rustle of turning bodies. The air was close and warm, thick with the smell of unwashed wool, straw, and humanity. It was not comfortable, but it was shelter. It was safety from the night and the road. The day's travel, the forest, the ford, the village, the long leagues settled into your muscles as a deep, satisfying ache. As the last murmurs from below faded, and the inn fell into the deep quiet of night, broken only by the occasional cough or the stamp of a horse in the stable below, you let the rhythm of the stranger's snores and the residual warmth of the fire in your bones lull you into a hard, dreamless sleep. Chapter 7. Dawn and Departure. A harsh, metallic clanging shattered the deep quiet of the loft. It was the innkeeper's wife, standing at the foot of the stairs, vigorously ringing a handbell. "Sun's up! Rouse yourselves!" she called, her voice sharp with morning practicality. The shared room came to life, not with urgency, but with a slow, groaning inevitability. Bodies shifted on the pallets. A man coughed, a wet, racking sound. Another sat up, scratching his beard, his shadow large and distorted on the sloping ceiling in the gray dawnlight, now seeping through a small, unshuttered window. The symphony of snores was replaced by the creak of rope webbing and the rustle of straw as travelers pushed back their rough blankets and began the process of pulling on boots stiff, cold leather that required patient tugging. You rose with them, the routine now familiar. You rolled your cloak, still warm from your body, and tied it to your bedroll. Your spare hose, laid out the night before, were cool and slightly damp from the loft's chill air. You pulled them on, then your boots, lacing them methodically. The saddlebags were repacked with the same orderly care as the morning before. The loaf of bread, now cool but still wholesome, wrapped in its cloth. The diminished wedge of cheese, the lighter wineskin. The dagger was checked at your belt, its presence a simple fact of readiness. Downstairs, the common room was transformed. The great hearth held only embers, giving off a dull, smoky heat. The long tables were now set with wooden bowls and cups. The innkeeper's wife ladled a thin gray porridge from a blackened iron pot into each bowl. A jug of weak, small beer, the standard morning drink, safer than water, was passed from hand to hand. You took your place on a bench, eating the porridge quickly. It was bland and gluey, salted just enough to be palatable. The beer was sour and thin, but it washed the meal down and cleared the night's thickness from your throat. Conversation was minimal, limited to muttered requests for the jug or comments on the weather. The fellowship of the shared night was gone, replaced by the individual focus of the day's impending travel. Breakfast done, you carried your gear out into the yard. The air was cold and fresh, smelling of dew and damp stone. A pale sun was beginning to burn off the ground mist, turning it into luminous tendrils that curled around the stable's thatched eaves. Inside the stable, the boy was already forking fresh hay. Elara stood in her stall, her coat ruffled from sleep. You ran your hands over her, starting at her neck and moving down her shoulders and back, feeling for any heat or swelling, any sign of stiffness from the previous day's labor. Her muscles were cool and relaxed under your palms. You lifted each hoof, checking for lodged stones or tender spots, but found only clean horn and the familiar pattern of her shoes. She was sound. You gave her the measure of oats promised, watching as she ate with quiet contentment, her crunching loud in the quiet stable. Saddling her was the work of a few practiced minutes. The felt pad smoothed over her back, the saddle settled, the girth tightened with firm, even pulls. You fastened the bags behind the cantle, their weight and balance known by feel. Finally, you sought out the innkeeper, who was tallying something on a notched stick by the gate. "My reckoning," you said. He looked up, squinting. "For the mare's oats and the stable? That'll be the penny you gave the boy and another for the lodging and meal." You drew out your purse and selected a single silver penny, its edges clipped from countless previous transactions. You placed it in his broad, calloused palm. He tested its weight briefly between his fingers, nodded, and dropped it into a leather pouch at his waist without a word. The transaction was complete. You led Elara out of the yard and back onto the road. The mist was thinning rapidly now, the pale sun gaining strength, its light still weak but clear. The world seemed freshly washed, colors emerging, the dark brown of the track, the faded gold of the autumn grasses in the ditches, the deep green of distant pines on a hillside. You swung up into the saddle. The leather creaked its familiar protest, then settled. With a gentle pressure of your knees, Elara stepped forward. Her hooves made a soft, wet sound in the damp earth. The rhythm of travel, the steady, rocking motion of the walk, the feel of the reins, the slow unwinding of the track ahead re-established itself seamlessly, as if the night at the inn had been but a brief pause in a single continuous motion. The road east awaited, and you moved into it, the last of the morning mist curling around your horse's legs before dissolving into the new day. Chapter 8: The Open Fields and the Sky. The forest, which had clung to the road for leagues, finally released its hold. The track emerged from a final stand of birch and alder, as if stepping through a doorway, and the world opened up. The sky, which for days had been a fragmented thing glimpsed through a lattice of branches, now presented itself whole. It was a vast, pale dome of washed-out blue, streaked with high, thin clouds like combed wool. The sense of space was immediate and physical, a loosening of the shoulders, a deeper breath drawn. The air lost its woody dampness, carrying instead the dry, clean scent of turned earth and cured grass. Before you stretched a landscape of gentle, rolling hills. They were not wild, but ordered, divided into a patchwork of plots by low walls of gathered gray stone. This was the cultivated land, the source of bread and rent, laid out with a geometry that spoke of generations of labor. To your left, a field lay fallow, a rough stubble of yellowed stalks and weeds, providing scant grazing for a few bony sheep. Ahead and to the right, the earth was dark and freshly plowed, the furrows running in long, parallel lines up the slope, waiting for the winter wheat. Beyond that, a field of pale, harvested barley stubble shone like beaten gold in the morning light. The three-field rotation fallow, winter crop, spring crop was visible in a single glance, the ancient rhythm of sustenance written on the land. Within these plots, figures moved. Near the track, a man and a woman, their backs bent, worked with short, hooked knives at the base of gnarled vines, trained on low wooden frames. They were serfs, their clothes the same dun color as the soil, their movements economical and tireless. They did not look up as you passed. Their world was the few feet of earth before them, their duty to the lord of the manor whose demesne this was. Their lives were bound to these strips of soil, as surely as the vines were bound to their frames. On a low rise in the middle distance stood that lord's house. It was no castle, not here in this peaceful, fertile country. It was a long, low hall of timber and pale stone with a steeply pitched roof of thatch. A wattle fence enclosed a yard, from which the thin smoke of a hearth fire rose straight into the still air. It was a seat of local power, unfortified but dominant, from which the bailiff would collect the sheaves and the chicken rents that sustained the world of the hall and the church. The walking was easy here. The track, used by carts fetching the manor's produce, was wide and firm. Ilara's pace settled into a steady, mile-eating walk. The sun, climbing towards its zenith, felt warm on the back of your neck where your hood lay folded. Its heat seeped through the wool of your tunic, a pleasant counter to the cool breeze that whispered across the open ground. Your mind, freed from the need to navigate close trees or a tricky ford, began to wander not into memory or fancy, but along the lines of the landscape itself. You noted the weight and drape of your cloak where it lay across the saddle behind you, the way its hem occasionally brushed against Ilara's flank. You observed the flight of a skylark, a tiny, singing speck ascending until it vanished into the brightness. Your thoughts were not deep. They were ambient, tied to sensation and the slow passage of leagues. The purpose of this place was manifest, enduring, and simple. Every low wall marked a boundary of obligation. Every furrow was a line in an account book of survival. The distant peasants were human components of an agricultural engine that turned sunlight and rain into grain, and grain into power. This was the foundation upon which everything else, the towns, the monasteries, the wars, the journeys of merchants and pilgrims, was built. It was a landscape of quiet, relentless production, beautiful in its ordered utility, humbling in its scale and its demand for ceaseless toil. You rode on, the immense sky above, the geometric earth below. The only sounds were the steady clop of hooves, the distant cry of the lark, and the sigh of the wind through the dry grass in the ditches. It was a space for travel, for covering distance without obstruction, a league after league of open, patient land that asked nothing of you but passage, and offered in return the simple, profound gift of the horizon. Chapter 9. The Monastery Guest House. The rain began not as a storm, but as a steady, patient drizzle that had started mid-morning. By afternoon, it had settled into a gray, soaking curtain that turned the track to a slick ochre paste and dripped incessantly from the brim of your hood. The open fields offered no shelter, only the long, wet sigh of the wind. Your wool cloak, once a barrier, became a heavy, sodden weight. Ilara's head drooped, water beading on her eyelashes and streaming from her mane. The need for shelter was not dramatic, but a practical, physical imperative. You saw the wall first, a long, high barrier of mortared gray stone emerging from the murk like the hull of a great ship. Then the roof, a steep pitch of dark slate, and above it, a simple wooden cross, stark against the clouds. A Benedictine monastery, a place of prayer, of silence, and by the ancient rule of Saint Benedict, a place of guaranteed hospitality for the traveler. The gatehouse was a squat, arched tunnel in the wall. You dismounted, your boots sinking into the mud of the approach, and pulled on a rusted iron bell chain. The clang was dulled by the rain. After a moment, a small wooden shutter within the gate slid open. A pair of eyes, pale and calm in a shadowed face, regarded you. "A traveler," you said, your voice rough from the damp, "seeking shelter from the rain, by the grace of your house." The shutter closed. There was a sound of a heavy bar being drawn back, and one half of the great oak door swung inward just enough to admit you and your horse. You led Ilara through into a wide cobbled courtyard. The rain fell here too, but the enclosing walls gave an immediate sense of respite. The air smelled different, wet stone, wood smoke, and beneath it, the faint, sweet scent of incense. The lay brother who had opened the gate stood waiting. He was a sturdy man of middle years, dressed in a simple, undyed woolen habit, his tonsure a gray fringe around a sun-browned scalp. He said nothing, only gestured for you to follow. He led you across the courtyard under the shelter of a covered walkway that ran along one side the cloister. Through its arched openings, you glimpsed a square of green garden, beaten flat by the rain. The guest house was a separate plain building of stone near the outer wall. The brother pushed open its door, revealing a single, whitewashed cell. It contained a narrow wooden cot with a straw-stuffed pallet, a small table with a clay jug and basin, and a single unglazed window shuttered against the weather. A tallow candle in an iron holder sat on the table. It was austere, clean, and dry. "Vespers in half an hour," the brother said, his voice low and measured. "The refectory for guests is through that door at the end of the walk. Supper after the office." He gave a slight bow of his head and withdrew, his sandals whispering on the stone floor. "You attended to Alara first, leading her to a simple lean-to stable where a dry stall and fresh hay had been provided. You rubbed her down with handfuls of straw, the steam rising from her warm coat in the damp air. The routine of care was a silent gratitude. Back in your cell, you hung your soaked cloak on a peg where it dripped a dark puddle on the floor. You changed into your spare, dry hose and tunic, the simple comfort profound. The silence of the place was not an absence, but a presence, a thick, palpable quiet, broken only by the distant, rhythmic chanting of the divine office from the church, and the soft, eternal patter of rain on slate. When a bell began to toll, deep and resonant, you followed the sound. You entered the church through a small door, reserved for layfolk. Inside, the world dimmed further. The air was cool and still, heavy with the smells of old incense, damp stone, and the faint beeswax sweetness of burning candles. The nave was shadowy, the only light coming from the sanctuary lamps and a few high, narrow windows of thick greenish glass. The architecture was solid, Romanesque, round arches, thick pillars, a sense of weight and permanence. The monks, perhaps 24 of them, stood in their choir stalls, their black habits merging with the gloom. Their backs were to you. As the prior intoned a Latin psalm, the community answered, their voices merging into a single, seamless stream of sound Gregorian chant. It was not a melody as the world outside knew it, but a rising and falling recitative, a river of pure, unaccompanied tone that seemed to flow from the stones themselves. It washed over you, not with emotional force, but with a strange impersonal clarity, stripping away the noise of the road, the memory of the rain, the petty concerns of the body. You stood at the back, a spectator to this ancient, daily rhythm of praise, until the final times, amen times, faded into the silence from which it had come. Supper was taken in a small plain room adjacent to the guest house. You were joined by 2 other travelers, a silent, weary-looking pilgrim and a merchant's guard with a broken arm in a sling. A lay brother served a meal in utter silence, as the rule dictated. The fare was simple and reflected monastic discipline: a thick slice of coarse, dark bread, a bowl of boiled beans and onions, seasoned with nothing but salt, 2 small pieces of salted fish. Invide. A jug of water and one of weak-watered wine completed the meal. It was food for sustenance, not indulgence, consumed without conversation, the only sounds the scrape of wooden spoons on pottery and the crackle of the small fire in the hearth. After eating, you returned to your cell. The candle cast a small, jumping sphere of light. The pallet was hard, the straw sparse. You lay on it, feeling the unyielding wood beneath. The profound quiet of the night cloister settled around you, deeper than any forest or field. It was a silence of chosen contemplation, broken only by the distant, periodic ringing of the bell for the night office's matins, lauds marking the hours when the monks rose to pray while the world slept. Near dawn, as you fetched water from the courtyard well, you encountered one of the older monks, his hands tucked into his sleeves, walking a slow, meditative circuit of the cloister walk. His face was lined and peaceful. He paused as you drew your bucket. "You travel east, brother?" he asked, his voice as quiet as the dawn mist. "To Strasbourg, God willing." He nodded slowly. "The road is long. But the Psalms say, 'The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in.'" He made a small sign of the cross in the air before you. Go with that. It is the only safety. You bowed your head in acknowledgement. My thanks for your hospitality, Father. It is our duty, he said simply, and resumed his slow walk, his sandals whispering on the damp stone. The conversation was over a brief, pious exchange about the spiritual, not the physical, perils of the journey. Back in your cell, you packed your dry clothes. Your damp cloak still hung heavy, but it would have to serve. You saddled Elara in the stable lean-to. The rain had ceased, leaving a world washed clean and dripping. As you led her out through the gatehouse, the lay brother who had admitted you gave the same silent nod. You passed back into the world of weather and roads, the memory of the chant, the smell of incense and stone, and the profound, echoing quiet of the night cloister sealed behind the great wall, a temporary haven already receding into the past as the wet track stretched ahead. Chapter 10. The Merchant's Tale. The rain-washed world sparkled under a clear, cold sky. The track, though muddy, was firmer than the day before, and Alara's steps were light, her coat dry and brushed. You had traveled perhaps 2 hours from the monastery's gate when the sound of other travelers reached you from behind. The rhythmic creak of ungreased axles, the clop of multiple hooves, and the low, grumbling conversation of men. You glanced back. A small merchant train was catching up, a single, high-sided cart pulled by a pair of stolid oxen, its canvas cover stained and patched. A man rode beside it on a sturdy, well-fed palfrey, and 2 others, likely guards or drivers, walked alongside. You guided Alara to the side of the track, allowing them to draw even. The rider, a man of perhaps 40, with a close-cropped beard and a practical wool cloak pinned with a simple bronze brooch, nodded to you. "Good day for it, now the sky's cleared," he said, his voice carrying the easy tone of a man used to talking to strangers. "It is," you agreed, falling in beside him as the cart rumbled past, its wheels carving fresh grooves in the mud. The 2 walkers gave you incurious looks and moved ahead, staying close to the oxen. For a league, you rode in companionable silence, the only sounds the creak of the cart, the snort of the horses, and the squelch of hooves and wheels. The merchant seemed content with the quiet, his eyes constantly moving between the road ahead, his cart, and the bordering woods, a habit of assessment. Eventually, he spoke again, not as one beginning a conversation, but continuing an internal one aloud. "Made better time yesterday, before the rain. Lost a morning to a loose wheel nail outside of bar. Cost me a penny to the wheelwright and his boy." He shook his head. A practical man, lamenting a practical setback. "The roads are soft," you offered. "Aye, and will be worse north of the river, I'll warrant. The toll road by the Bishop's Bridge is the better clay, but his agent there charges a full times, denier times per axle, and 2 for a horse. The ford upstream is cheaper, but if the axle breaks in the mire, you lose a day and pay the smith more than the toll." He spoke of these calculations not with frustration, but with the detached air of a player discussing the rules of a familiar game. "You heading for the Frankfurt fairs?" "Strasbourg," you said. "Strasbourg is good, busy, but Frankfurt," he let out a low breath, almost a sigh of reverence for commerce. "The prices there, especially for northern goods. Woolens from the Low Countries, the fine, tight-woven stuff, you can get a better margin even after the tolls and the guards pay. If the Count's peace holds on the Rhine road, that is. Last season, a man I know lost half a cart of tin to river pirates near Mainz. They're bold as brass. His talk was a stream of worldly concerns, the reliability of guards, the greed of toll keepers who were often petty lords or their grasping stewards, the quality of iron from the Saxon mines versus the local bloomeries. It was not dramatic, but it painted a vivid picture of the fragile networks that spanned Christendom, networks of trust, risk, and hard currency. He asked no personal questions of you, and you offered none. The relationship was temporary and functional. As the sun climbed towards its zenith, you reached a small clearing where a fallen tree trunk provided a dry seat. The merchant called a halt to rest the oxen. You both dismounted. From your saddlebag, you produced the linen pouch of dried apple rings, leathery and sweet. You offered a few to the merchant. He took them with a nod of thanks. Kind of you. He chewed one slowly, appreciatively. Good, better than hardtack. My wife packs me walnuts, but I finished them 2 days ago. In return, he offered you a pull from a leather flask hanging from his saddle. The liquid inside was not wine or beer, but a strong, clear apple brandy that burned a clean path down your throat. It was a traveler's luxury. The two of you sat in silence for a few minutes, eating the apples, watching the drivers check the oxen's harnesses. The encounter was devoid of drama or deeper connection. It was an exchange of minor comforts and professional observations, the fleeting fellowship of the road. Soon, the merchant stood, brushing bark from his trousers. "Time eats silver," he said, another maxim of his trade. He mounted his palfrey. You rode together for another hour until the track forked. The main way, broader and more deeply rutted, continued east, your path. A narrower, less traveled branch curved away to the northeast, following the line of a stream. "My road," the merchant said, reining in. "The North Bridge is another 6 leagues. God grant you a safe journey to Strasbourg." "And you good prices in Frankfurt," you replied. He gave a final, brief smile, more a tightening of the eyes than a movement of the mouth, and turned his horse. With a click of his tongue and a call to his men, the small train lurched into motion onto the northern branch. The cart's wheels rattled over a patch of stones, the sound sharp in the quiet air. You watched them go for a moment. The cart, the plodding oxen, the rider, the 2 walking men. Then they rounded a bend screened by hazel trees and were gone, the rumble of the wheels fading until only the natural sounds of the forest edge remained. You turned Elada's head back to the eastern track. The merchant's words of tolls, cloth, and margins lingered not as a story, but as a layer of context. They were the whispers of the larger world flowing around you, a world of goods and journeys that made your own simple travel possible. The encounter was over, as undramatic and natural as the parting of 2 streams. You touched your heels to Alara's sides, and she stepped forward, leaving the fork behind, the rhythm of your solitary travel reasserting itself with the next step and the next. Chapter 10, The Hill and the View, Part 1. The land began to rise. It was not a sudden slope, but a long, gentle insistence that announced itself first in Elara's breathing. The steady, easy rhythm of her exhalations, a soft puff of vapor in the cool afternoon air, deepened into a more deliberate, audible sigh with each forward step. Your own breath soon matched it, coming a little quicker, a little fuller, as the track began its patient, unrelenting climb. You had seen the hill from a league off, a long, whale-backed ridge covered in a scrubby furs of heather and gorse, its crest cutting a clean, dark line against the pale sky. Now, as the road curved to meet its base, the effort of the ascent became a tangible, physical fact. The easy, rolling fields were behind you. The track here was pale, the earth beneath a thin skin of grass giving way to chalky, flint-studded clay that crumbled underfoot. The vegetation changed in sympathy with the altitude. The sturdy oaks and beeches of the lower slopes grew stunted and wind-sculpted, their branches all leaning eastward, away from the prevailing weather. Between them, thickets of hawthorn and blackthorn formed impenetrable, thorny barriers, their leaves already touched with autumn bronze. After the first steady quarter-hour of climbing, you dismounted. It was a practical decision, a matter of husbandry. A horse carrying a rider uphill worked twice, once to lift its own mass, again to lift yours. On a long slope, it was wiser to share the burden. Your boots, scuffing the chalky path, now joined the sound of Elara's hooves in a slower, more labored duet. The act of walking the incline was a full-body engagement. The burn began in your thighs, a familiar, deep ache that spread upwards into your hips with each step. your calves tightened. You adjusted your gait, leaning forward slightly into the slope, using the muscles of your back and shoulders to counterbalance the weight of the saddlebags. The leather straps dug into your tunic with a new, insistent pressure. You reached back occasionally to shift them, a minor redistribution of load that offered fleeting relief. The world narrowed to the mechanics of the climb. Your focus was on the placement of your feet, avoiding the loose, skittering flints that could turn an ankle, finding purchase on the firmer patches of clay. The wind, which had been a whisper in the valley, found its voice here, whistling through the thorns and tugging at the edges of your hood. It carried a clean, dry scent of crushed thyme and cold stone, stripping away the richer, lowland smells of soil and leaf mold. Time changed its nature. The steady, league-consuming rhythm of the flatlands dissolved. Progress was no longer measured in landmarks passed, but in the slow accumulation of altitude, in the gradual shift of perspective as the valley behind you began to open up, flatten, and recede. Each breath was a conscious act. Each heartbeat thumped a little louder in your ears, a drum marking the slow, arduous passage. The burn in your legs was not pain, but a testament to work being done, a physical ledger of the hill's height. You walked beside Elada, your hand resting on her sweaty neck for balance and solidarity. Her warmth was a constant through your glove. She leaned into the harness of the slope, her powerful shoulders rolling with each step, her head nodding in time with her effort. You spoke to her seldom, only the occasional low murmur of encouragement times steady good girl times more for the tone than the words. The shared labor created a silent, profound understanding between you. The hill was an adversary, to be met not with haste, but with patient, enduring force. Halfway up, you paused by a wind-blasted thorn tree, its roots clawing into the chalk. Both of you were breathing heavily now, plumes of vapor mingling in the cold air. You took a small sip from your water skin, the water tasting of leather and cold, then held it for Elada to drink a little from your cupped hand. The rest was a brief, necessary recalibration. You checked the saddle's girth, which had loosened slightly with the climb, and tightened it a notch. The simple, methodical acts, drinking, adjusting gear, were anchors in the slow, demanding flow of the ascent. Then you moved on. The track coiled back on itself in a wide switchback, revealing a new vista of the land below. The forest you had traveled through that morning was a rumpled blanket of green and gold. The river you had forded days ago was a thin silver thread glimpsed between distant hills. The view was not yet the reward. It was a byproduct of the effort, a reminder of the distance already woven into your muscles and bones. The climb continued. The burn in your legs settled into a constant, glowing presence. Your world became the next 10 paces of pale, chalky track. The sound of 2 sets of laboring breaths, the feel of the cold wind, and the slow, undeniable pull of gravity being overcome. Step by patient step. There was no drama in it, only the pure, undiluted physics of travel, the slowing of time to the pace of the body's enduring strength. The summit was not yet in sight, but it was in every fiber of your being, a destination written in fire along your thighs and in the deep, steady rhythm of your heart. Chapter 10. The Hill and the View. Part 2. The summit arrived not as a dramatic crest, but as a gradual easing. The relentless tug of the slope lessened. The chalky track leveled onto a broad, windswept plateau of tough, springy grass and exposed, gray-white bedrock. The wind, which had been a constant companion on the climb, now roared in full, unimpeded voice, a river of cold air flowing over the ridge. It pulled at your hood and cloak with insistent fingers and made Elara's mane and tail stream like banners. You stopped. For a long moment, you simply stood, your legs trembling slightly with released effort, and breathed. The air was thin, clean, and sharp as a knife blade in your lungs. Then you turned and looked back the way you had come. The world was laid out below like a vast, living tapestry. The forest through which you had journeyed for days was no longer an enclosing wall of green, but a rumpled carpet of autumn-color ochre, bronze, and dark evergreen spread across the hills and valleys. The silver thread of the river you had forded now revealed its full course, a lazy, looping scribble of light through the landscape. The patchwork of fields around the monastery and the village were neat, geometric quilts of brown, gold, and fallow gray, stitched together by dark lines of hedgerow and stone wall. Roads were faint, tan scars. The manor house was a tiny, pale smudge. The sense of scale was humbling. The leagues you had measured in sweat, hoof falls, and aching muscles were now compressed into a single, sweeping glance. This was the medieval traveler's true map. Not lines on parchment, but this lived, physical geography of forest, field, and water, understood through the body's labor. Your gaze traveled east, following the track as it descended the far side of the hill into a new valley, then rose again towards a distant, hazy horizon. And there, just at the limit of sight, where the earth met the sky in a blur of autumn mist, was a faint, gray smudge. Within it, catching the low afternoon sun like the tips of needles, were the barest hints of spires. Strasbourg, the goal, now a tangible presence in the world, not just an idea. The sight connected the arduous climb directly to its purpose. The hill had been an obstacle, but also a vantage point, making the distance meaningful. You led Elara to a large, flat-topped rock that offered a slight lee from the wind. Looping her reins over a stunted juniper bush, you sat, the cold stone seeping through your cloak and hose. You unstopped your water skin and drank deeply. The water was profoundly cold, washing the dust of the climb from your throat. The wind roared in your ears, a sound so constant it became a new kind of silence. This was a moment of pure contemplation, but it was not introspective in a modern sense. Your thoughts did not turn inward to feelings or memories. They remained fixed on the external, on the relationship between the land below and the body that had traversed it. You observed the way the shadows of clouds drifted like great, silent ships across the forests and fields. You noted the flight of a raven, a black speck riding the updrafts along the ridge, its rough call torn away by the gale. You understood this view as a rare privilege. Most travelers, especially those on foot or with heavy carts, would have taken the longer, lower route around the hill's flank. The climb had been a choice for speed or perhaps for this, a moment of geographic clarity, a resetting of the mind to the true scale of the journey. After a time, you stood, your muscles stiff from the cold and the recent effort. You took a handful of oats from your pouch and let Elara eat them from your palm, her lips soft and whiskery. Then you loosened her girth and removed her bit, letting her graze on the thin, wiry grass that grew in clumps between the rocks. She lowered her head, tearing at the tough blades with a contented rhythm, her sweat already drying in the wind. You stood beside her, your hand resting on her warm flank, and looked once more from the receding landscape of your past to the promising haze of your future. The wind scoured you clean of the road's dust and the climb's fatigue. There was no triumph in the moment, only a quiet, solid satisfaction, the satisfaction of a task understood in its entirety, of an obstacle met and passed, of a destination finally visible in the flesh of the world. It was a confirmation, written in earth, sky, and stone, that you were on the right path and that the path was nearing its end. Finally, you replaced Elara's bit, tightened the girth, and mounted. The descent awaited, a different kind of labor for her knees and your balance. With a last look at the vast, silent panorama, you turned her head towards the eastern slope, and the wind, now at your back, pushed you gently towards the distant spires and the gathering dusk. Chapter 11. The Bridge and the Toll. The descent from the hill's summit was a careful, deliberate process. The eastern slope was steeper, the pale chalk track switching back more sharply, its surface loose and treacherous with skittering flints. You dismounted again, walking ahead of Elara, your boots braced against the incline, guiding her with a firm hand on her bridle. She picked her way down with delicate, deliberate steps, her haunches lowered, her iron shoes scraping and slipping on the stones. The wind's roar faded as you lost altitude, replaced by the closer sounds of your controlled descent, the crunch of gravel, the creak of straining leather, the soft, blowing breaths of concentration. Within an hour, the slope gentled, merging into a wide, flat valley carved by a substantial river. The air grew damp and cool, carrying the mineral scent of fast-moving water. The track, now level and well-packed, ran straight as a ruled line between water meadows where the grass grew lush and green even in autumn. Ahead, the river revealed itself a broad, muscular flow of gray-green water, perhaps 50 paces across, moving with a deep, powerful murmur. Spanning it was the reason for the road's straightness, a stone bridge. It was a solid, practical piece of engineering from a previous century. 3 round arches of dressed limestone rose from sturdy piers in the river's flow. The roadway across was wide enough for a single cart, flanked by low parapets of the same gray stone, worn smooth by weather and the touch of countless hands. At the near end of the bridge stood its reason for being, a squat, square tower of rougher masonry, 2 stories high, with a timbered upper floor and a single, narrow door. From a pole jutting over the door hung a faded, wind-tattered banner bearing an indistinct heraldic device, a boar, perhaps, or a bear. This was the toll house. As you approached, a man emerged from the tower's shadow. He was thick-set, dressed in a leather jerkin over a stained wool tunic with a simple iron cap on his head. A short, broad-bladed spear leaned against the wall behind him. He was not a soldier, but an agent, a petty lord's man, or perhaps the lord's younger, landless cousin, given this duty for his upkeep. His face was broad and impassive, his eyes performing a quick, assessing inventory of you and your horse. You drew Alara to a halt a few paces from him. The ritual was familiar. "Toll for the bridge," the man stated, his voice flat. It was not a question. "For a man and a horse," you said, equally neutral. "3 times deniers," he said, naming a price that was, as expected, slightly inflated. You allowed a faint, weary skepticism to show on your face, a traveler's practiced response. 3? It was 2 at the last bridge, and that was wider. He shrugged, a movement that said the last bridge was not his concern. "This is the bishop's bridge. The stonework is kept. 3. The horse is not a cart. She makes no wear on the stone. 2 times deniers. Times is fair. End. Hymas." Your tone was not argumentative, but factual, the mild haggling of the road. The man's eyes flicked over Elara again, noting her serviceable but unremarkable tack, your worn but decent gear. He weighed the certainty of 2 coins against the possibility of you turning back or, more likely, attempting to find a ford upstream and depriving him of anything. 2.5, he countered, a token gesture. You shook your head slowly, your hand resting on your purse. 2 in copper. 2. A moment of silence hung between you, filled by the river's murmur. Then he gave a single curt nod. 2, then. You opened your purse and selected 2 of the small, worn copper coins. They were times deniers, times of local minting, their faces blurred by countless transactions. You placed them in his outstretched palm. His fingers closed over them, and he turned them with his thumb, checking their metal with a bite he didn't bother to hide. Satisfied, he dropped them into a leather bag at his belt and stepped aside, jerking his head towards the bridge. "Pass!" You led Alara forward onto the stone causeway. The sound changed instantly. The soft thud of hooves on earth became a sharp, echoing times clop, clop, clop times on the worn flagstones. The river's murmur rose from below, amplified by the arch. You walked to the center of the bridge and paused, leaning slightly over the parapet. Below, the river's true nature was visible. The water, which from the bank had seemed a uniform flow, was here a complex, powerful creature. It swirled in dark eddies around the mossy stone piers, foamed white over submerged rocks, and flowed with a steady, muscular pull towards the north. The air here was fresh and damp, smelling of wet stone and cold water. A movement downstream caught your eye. A flat-bottomed barge, little more than a long, shallow box of tarred planks, was being poled laboriously against the current. Two men, one at the bow and one at the stern, drove long poles into the riverbed, walking the length of the barge with a slow, rocking gait, pushing it forward a few feet with each effort. The barge was laden with rough-cut timber. Their progress was agonizingly slow, a testament to the river's strength and the sheer physicality of trade before the age of sails on such inland waters. You watched them for a minute, a silent acknowledgement of a different kind of journey, before moving on. Reaching the far bank, you stepped off the stone flags and onto the road. The change was immediate and subtle, a traveler's intuition confirmed by small signs. The road here was maintained differently. The ruts were shallower, the drainage ditches at the sides freshly dug. The trees flanking the track were of a different mix, more pine and spruce than oak. The very quality of the light seemed altered, filtered through a different arrangement of land and sky. You had passed not just a river, but a boundary. The toll was the legal marker, but the land itself announced you were now under the protection and the jurisdiction of a new lord, likely the bishop, whose bridge you had just paid to cross. Your safety, such as it was, now depended on his peace, and your obligations, should you tarry, would be to his officers. You mounted Elara, the saddle creaking. A glance back showed the toll-keeper had retreated into the shadow of his tower, a solitary figure already fading into the stone. Ahead, the road continued east, following the river valley. The transaction was complete. A minor friction in the journey's flow, now past. The two small copper coins were gone, a tiny fraction of your resources exchanged for the right to move through a controlled landscape. You touched your heels to Elara's sides, and she stepped out, her hooves once again making a soft sound in the earth of a new territory. Chapter 12. The Last Leg in Evening Light. The sun, having passed its zenith during the long climb and the bridge crossing, now hung low in the western sky. It was no longer a source of heat, but of light, a rich, honeyed gold that poured across the land, stretching every shadow to impossible lengths. The track, now following the gentle contours of the river valley, was painted in alternating bands of molten gold and deep, cool indigo. Elara's shadow walked beside her, a long, distorted giant that flowed over the ruts and tussocks. Your body was a catalog of the day's labor. The deep, glowing ache in your thighs from the hill's ascent had settled into a permanent, dull presence. Your shoulders were tight from the weight of the bags and the constant, subtle adjustments of balance. The small of your back held a knot of fatigue. Yet this was not the sharp, protesting pain of injury or overexertion. It was the settled weariness of endurance, a familiar state where the body has passed a threshold and now, simply times, is functioning on the deep reserves of habit and rhythm. You were tired, but you were not spent. The journey was in your muscles and bones, a part of you. The valley was peaceful in the evening light. The river, off to your left, gleamed like polished pewter. The air grew still, losing the wind of the heights, and carried the damp, clean scent of water and the sweet, dusty smell of sun-warmed grass going to seed. The only sounds were Elara's steady hoof falls, the creak of leather, and the distant, mournful cry of a curlew from the water meadows. Then a new sound woven into the twilight, a gentle, chaotic cacophony of bells. Not the single, authoritative toll of a church or town, but 100 soft, high, discordant chimes. Rounding a bend, you saw their source. A shepherd, an old man leaning on a tall, crooked staff, was moving a flock of perhaps 200 sheep from the open pastures towards a fold near a cluster of wattled huts. The sheep flowed like dirty, bleeding water around his legs, their wool gray and brown in the fading light. Around the necks of the led ewes and the old bellwether ram were wooden bells, each with its own distinct tone, creating a living, moving soundscape that spoke of orderly return, of the daily rhythm of the pastoral world. The shepherd saw you, raised his staff in a silent, timeless gesture of acknowledgement, and returned to his work, his voice a low, grumbling murmur to his dogs. You passed by, the sweet smell of lanolin and damp wool lingering in the air, the bells fading slowly behind you like a fading cord. The light deepened, from gold to a fiery orange. The spires of Strasbourg, glimpsed from the hill, were now hidden by the folds of the land and the gathering haze of distance and wood smoke. You knew they were there, perhaps 3 or 4 leagues ahead. The end was a practical certainty, not a destination that sparked excitement. Your thoughts turned not to the city's wonders, its bustling markets, its imposing cathedral, but to the immediate, familiar sequence that would follow arrival. You thought of the stable you would find, not the grandest, but one you knew from previous travels, where the straw was clean and the stable master did not water the oats. You thought of the methodical routine of caring for Elara, removing the saddle and bags, the careful rubbing down with twists of straw to dry her sweat, the inspection of her hooves, the measure of good grain, the fresh hay net. It was a ritual of gratitude and responsibility, a silent conversation of mutual dependence. You thought of the inn nearby, its common room smoky and loud, the bowl of pottage, the shared pallet in the loft. It was not comfort you anticipated, but the predictable order of it. The removal of boots, the checking of your few possessions, the slow letting go of the road's tension as the sounds of the city a different, more complex hum than the road's silence lulled you to sleep. The expectation was calm, professional. The journey's purpose was nearly fulfilled, and the routines at its end were as much a part of the work as the travel itself. The last of the color bled from the sky, leaving a band of pale green on the horizon that slowly darkened to violet. The first stars pricked through the vast, clear expanse overhead. A chill descended, and you pulled your cloak tighter around your shoulders. Elara's steps remained steady and sure, her energy reserved, knowing as animals do that the day's labor was nearing its end. You rode on, the world reduced to the dark shape of the road ahead, the glittering scatter of stars, and the solid, living warmth of the horse beneath you. The fatigue was a mantle you wore comfortably. The last leg was not a race, but a completion. A slow, deliberate winding down of motion, a seamless transition from the solitude of the open track to the gathered humanity of the city, guided by the calm, practical expectation of a task almost done. Chapter 13. The City Gates of Strasbourg. The last league was a transition in the dark. The open valley, with its river murmur and star-filled sky, gradually gave way to a more ordered landscape. The track became a proper road, its ditches deeper and more regularly maintained, its surface more heavily packed by traffic. The smells changed, too less of damp earth and wild grass, more of wood smoke, humanity, and the distant, complex tang of 1,000 hearths and trades. Then you saw the lights. At first, they were just a faint orange glow on the underside of the low clouds ahead, a false dawn in the wrong part of the sky. As you drew closer, the glow resolved into individual points, the flickering, restless flames of torches mounted on high walls. The walls themselves rose from the darkness, a vast black silhouette against the luminous haze, taller than any tree, more solid than any hill. Strasbourg, the road converged with others, and you were no longer alone. A small queue had formed at the gate, a farmer's cart loaded with late cabbages, a few footsore pilgrims, a mounted messenger looking bored atop a fidgety courser. You joined the back of this line, the final act of the road's rhythm. Elara, sensing the proximity of stables and rest, let out a soft, weary sigh. The gate was a massive structure of rusticated stone, flanked by 2 drum towers that bulged outward. A iron-clad portcullis was raised high in its throat, its sharpened teeth gleaming in the torchlight. In the arched gateway itself, 2 guards stood in patched surcoats over chainmail, their spears leaning against the wall. They worked with the bored efficiency of men performing a nightly ritual. The cart ahead was waved through after a brief muttered exchange. The pilgrims stated their business, prayer, at the cathedral, and were admitted. The messenger barely slowed, flashing a sealed parchment, and trotted through. Then it was your turn. One of the guards stepped forward, holding his torch aloft. The light played over you and Alara, glinting on the saddle's buckles and the damp wool of your cloak. His face was shadowed beneath an iron cap. "Business?" he asked, his voice flat. The question was a formality. "Travel," you said, your own voice rough from the road and the cool night air. He looked you up and down once more, a single man, a single horse, no obvious weapons but the utilitarian dagger, the bags of a long-distance rider. You were no threat, no noble requiring ceremony, no merchant worth taxing beyond the gate toll. You were simply traffic. He jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "Move along. The gate closes at the final bell. A times denier, times for the horse." You fished out the small copper coin and dropped it into his outstretched hand. He pocketed it without a glance and stepped aside. You passed under the shadow of the portcullis, the cold, damp smell of the stone archway enveloping you. For a moment, you were in a tunnel of darkness and echoing hoof-falls. Then you emerged into the city, and the world transformed. The sounds, which on the road had been singular and distant, became a dense, layered tapestry. The clop of your own horse's hooves was joined by a dozen others from nearby streets, echoing off cobbles and house fronts. Voices, calls, arguments, laughter spilled from shuttered windows and tavern doorways. A blacksmith, working late, sent a rhythmic times, clang, clang, clang times into the night. Somewhere, a dog barked incessantly. Under it all was a constant, low hum, the sound of thousands of people living in close proximity, a sound you had not heard for days. The smells were equally complex and immediate. No longer the clean scents of field and forest, but a rich, often pungent stew, wood smoke and roasting meat from a cookshop, the sour tang of spilled ale and vomit from an alley, the earthy, fecal smell of manure from the street itself, the sharp, nose-tingling aroma of tanned leather from a workshop, the sweetness of baking bread, now underlaid with the city's permanent bass note of stagnant water and humanity. It was overwhelming, vivid, and utterly real. You did not hesitate. You knew this city, or at least you knew its type and its patterns. Turning Elara onto a slightly narrower street that climbed away from the main gate, you navigated by memory and the looming bulk of the cathedral, its single, square tower, a darker black against the starry sky. The streets were a maze of timber-framed houses, their upper stories jutting out over the cobbles, their windows sealed with oiled parchment that glowed softly from within. After a few minutes of climbing through the bustling, shadowy lanes, you reached a quieter courtyard off a street that curved around the cathedral close. A familiar sign, a painted wooden horse's head, hung above a wide archway. The stable yard within was quiet, the night's boarders already settled. A lantern hung from a hook, casting a wobbly circle of light on the straw-strewn cobbles. The stablemaster, a grizzled man with a limp, emerged from a side door. He recognized you, or at least recognized a traveler who had come this way before and caused no trouble. He gave a curt nod. "The bay mare," you said, dismounting. "A full groom, good hay, a measure of oats. Same stall as last time," he grunted, taking Alara's reins. "She'll be seen to." You paid him, the transaction as wordless and efficient as the one at the gate. Then you took your saddlebags and bedroll and stepped back out into the street. The journey's end was not a climax, but this seamless transition from the road to the queue, from the queue to the gate, from the gate to the stable, one practical step following another until the travel was done. You found a tavern you knew, not far from the stable. It was quieter than those near the gates, frequented by local tradesmen and a few canons from the cathedral. You bought a bowl of mutton stew and a cup of ordinary wine, eating at a small table in the corner. The food was hot and salty. The wine was thin and sour. It was perfect. The road's stillness, that meditative focus born of days of rhythmic motion, still held within you, a quiet core amidst the city's noise. Later, before seeking your own pallet in the tavern's loft, you returned to the stable. The yard was dark now, the lantern extinguished. By the faint light from a city cresset filtering over the wall, you found Ilara's stall. She was clean, dry, and content, munching slowly on a net of sweet hay. You reached over the stall door and ran a hand down her neck, feeling the solid warmth of her, the steady pulse of life beneath her coat. The grooming, the care, it had been done, and done well. This final check, this silent communion in the dark, was the true end of the day's journey. It was a ritual of gratitude, wordless and profound. Back in the quiet tavern, as you pulled off your boots and lay on the hard pallet, a deep, resonant bell began to toll from the cathedral close. It was not the frantic ringing of an alarm, but the measured, sonorous voice of the great bell calling the hour of Compline, the last office of the day. Boom, boom, boom. The sound rolled through the stone and timber of the city, a vibration felt in the chest as much as heard by the ear. It spoke of order, of an end, of rest earned. You listened as the final note faded into the night, leaving only the distant, muffled sounds of the sleeping city. Then you closed your eyes. The road's long rhythm finally stilled and slept. The road never truly ends. There are forests we haven't crossed, cities we haven't reached, and centuries still waiting ahead. If this journey brought you calm, you're invited to join future travels. Subscribe and become part of this quiet fellowship of travelers. Until our next road, sleep deeply.